A summit in Doha billed as a last chance to negotiate a hostage release deal. The long wait for the response from Iran and Hezbollah continues. And this week, our special guest is you as we take listeners' questions. It's Unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv. Unholy, two Jews on the news. Israel is still very much in a holding pattern. Monday night was a dramatic day in which everyone thought it was actually going to happen. The Iranian attack, or the coordinated Iranian and Hezbollah attack on Israel. It was, I remind you, Tisha B'Av, which is the historic day, the destruction of the two biblical temples. So everyone was thinking of that symbolism and kind of knowing that Iranians also think of historic symbolism. The IDF spokesperson was on air. It took him a few minutes to say nothing is changing in our directives. And everyone was, mind my Jewish expression here, everyone was a little bit on Spilkes on Monday, but it didn't happen on Monday, although I found myself saying, Jonathan, one of the weirdest sentences I've ever said on air, which was something like, contrary to rumors spread on social media tonight, the Iranian attack on Israel has not yet begun. Which, when you think about it, of all the crazy things one should say on air, that was definitely a moment.
Yeah, no, that is pretty crazy. I mean, each word of that you could unpack, things you wouldn't have said 10 years ago. This, I think the waiting game, and it's obviously not a game, is very deliberate. We unpacked last week all the different elements that are going into making this delay of a response to the killings of, Hezbollah leader, chief of staff in Beirut, and the leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, as a guest in Tehran. But one of them is the psychological impact. I mean, as you said, these are people who are alert to the niceties of the Jewish religious calendar. They will equally be alert to the psyche of the country they regard as, enemy number one. And they will know that this protracted wait, even you saying something like that on the evening news, it's all part of the anxiety, the tension, and, whether or not there are other factors to explain this of the kind that we did discuss 7 days ago, I think they will be surely regarding this as an added benefit, a kind of happy byproduct of this situation that the whole country is on tenterhooks, to add an inadequate translation of Spilkes for our non-Yiddish speakers. For them, it's all upside for the Iranians, I think.
Yes, and of course, what complicates things, and now I'm diving into the serious matters of this week, the fact that we are speaking here on Thursday, it's noon, and we know that the negotiations attempt at Doha are about to begin, what has been called by the Biden administration and by Israeli sources as, in fact, a last attempt at reaching a hostage deal. And you have Iranian officials telling Reuters this week, saying essentially, if a deal is agreed upon, if a ceasefire deal is arrived at, then we will consider delaying the attack on Israel. So that, of course, makes this whole sort of, maybe I shouldn't be using the image of poker, but this high stakes poker has become even higher when these are the stakes.
Yeah, I mean, that was a move, I think some people attribute to the Biden administration, this linkage of the two. It's hard for me to see. I can see exactly why the Biden administration would want to do it. I think it was Eisenhower who used to say, when you've got a problem, the best solution sometimes is to make it bigger, which is so counterintuitive. But when you've got already this huge knotty problem of months and months and months to get a hostage release deal and a ceasefire, inflate it, make it larger, almost in the way that it's easier to untie a knot when it's larger and you can sort of pull at it. I think that's sort of part of the thinking. But why the Iranians and others would make themselves, subject to that, to those conditions, is harder for me to work out. I mean, from the Iranian point of view, they may have their own reasons for wanting to stay their hand, as it were. But why they would want to tie their own right to avenge this insult, as they would see it, to the fate of a negotiation in which they are not a direct party, it's harder for me to work that out, what the sort of incentive structure is for that. But we do know there are the back channels from Washington to Tehran via the Swiss diplomatic mission. there are, and there will be others, that maybe there are other, carrots and sticks on the table that the Biden administration is offering to somehow induce Iran to think, well, look, if there is a ceasefire deal, that would not be the time to, antagonize and make worse this situation. I can sort of see that politically in terms of Iran standing in the region. But in terms of a quid pro quo, it's harder for me to work out.
Well, it works out if you think about Iran searching for a ladder, right? And if you think of the fact that there is a new president, that they want to protect the nuclear sites more than anything, that they threatened something that can come close to an all-out war because of a Hamas leader being killed in Iran. I'll remind you that there were much more important people to the Iranian regime, people like Fakhrizadeh, part of the nuclear planning, who were assassinated on Iranian soil, and Iran never did anything close to this. So it could be that Iran maybe, again, threatened something and then saw the very, very tough American response and the response of others in the region, and this gave them a ladder to step down from. But when you look at what happens to other players on this chessboard, right? If you think of Benjamin Netanyahu, and we were talking a lot about the fact that on the one hand, he's pushed by his extreme coalition not to go to a hostage deal. On the other hand, the Americans are saying to him, go to a ceasefire, and then we can, talk about the Northern Front and start discussing other issues. Now, when this is also about Iran saying we will step down, this becomes much more complicated. I just want to show you the strategic, if you zoom out on the strategic story here. 6 months ago, what was in front of Netanyahu was saying there will be a ceasefire, we'll try to quiet down the Northern Front, right? The Americans were saying this to him, and we might talk about Saudi normalization. Now what the world is saying to him is, you get a ceasefire, what we will talk about is getting Iran to step down from an attack on Israel. So the strategic difference here is pretty major when you think about it like that.
Yeah, and actually, when you put it like that, that's a bit of an indictment of Netanyahu. That the big prize was normalization with one of the region's most powerful players. Now it's just to sort of avert an attack. Mm-hmm. It's not an actual diplomatic gain. It's just the avoidance of something negative. Just two extra thoughts. One is, of course, there are 3 points to this triangle, and the other element in it is Hezbollah and their desire to avenge the attack on them in Beirut. And they have their own, as we got into this last week with Suzanne Maloney, how they have their own calculations. And one of the things that's been thought of is that while indeed, and I think you're absolutely right about that Iran may well want a ladder, an excuse not to have to hit Israel back because it's hard and inconvenient for them. The calculation may be very different in Beirut, and Hassan Nasrallah, for his own reasons and not to lose face, may feel he does need to hit back, and if anything has been impatient and been wanting to hit back sooner than in a way this sort of leash that has held him back.
Most definitely. Hezbollah still mean to retaliate for this. And by the way, we should remember that Israelis have a brief warning window for Hezbollah because it's much closer than the Iranians are. So that is definitely where the situation is. If we were talking about a perhaps coordinated attack between Iran and Hezbollah, and Israel getting a longer warning for this because whatever coming in from Iran takes longer to get here, Hezbollah is a much shorter window. We're still anticipating that, right? As we sit here at noon on Thursday, that is still very much an imminent possibility. I think it's important that we talk about what will go on in Doha, which is the hostage deal. We are 10 months in, and everyone is talking about this as the last opportunity to reach a deal. It's so interesting to me. I kind of realized this week that in the U.S. administration, when the president says something, that is the position of the U.S., period. Here, there is a very large rift between Netanyahu himself and the rest of the defense echelon, being Defense Minister Gallant, the IDF Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi, and others, the head of Shin Bet, the head of Mossad, who say, we have to reach a deal now. Now, there is a framework on the table. It's been there on the table since May. Netanyahu saying, no, I'm just trying to make these a little bit more accurate. And I'm worried about, we talked about this a lot, right? The Philadelphia corridor and the places where the smuggling is coming back from and who's going to be allowed up north in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. But essentially, the same deal has been on the table since May. And it is, say, all of the people to Netanyahu himself, this is the time to seize this deal and go for it.
Just on a human level, that fact, I'm just imagining if I were one of the hostage families and hearing that the deal that is the last best chance for the hostage release has been there for, 67, 90 days. How every one of those days, agony for your loved ones. And to think that the opportunity was there and could have been seized but wasn't, that's 90 more days of agony and pain for those hostages. Again, my disbelief that Netanyahu does not pay a higher price for doing this at the earliest possible opportunity. There is still noises off from Israeli officials briefing that they are still not certain how committed Netanyahu is to this. Constantly, this back and forth has been tweaking the conditions and the demands, rather than just thinking this deal may not be perfect, but just grab it because there are 50, 60, we don't know the number, of living hostages whose ordeal would be shortened by accepting this offer. That to me is extraordinary that hasn't happened.
Yeah, we should point out two different things. One is it took Hamas a few weeks after that to come back and say they agree to the framework. But I think importantly, it would be helpful to understand what the opinions are of the people who oppose this deal on the merits of the deal, which means the people who are worried, for instance, that if Israel leaves the Rafah crossing and the Philadelphia corridor, then there is no control over smuggling of weapons coming in from Egypt. That is what got us in this terrible calamity in the first place. For instance, people saying we can't just release all of the murderers and terrorists in the Israeli prisons. Look what happened last time that Israel released a large number of terrorists. One of them was Yahya Sinwar. And this is, again, what led us to this point. And how is it possible? And again, these are people who oppose the deal saying, how is it possible to just let everyone come back to the northern part of the Gaza Strip without any sort of supervision who these people are? And this will undermine the achievements of this war. And this is coming from people who actually want to have a serious discussion about the deal, but that isn't happening in the climate of the Israeli political sphere at this moment. And, many Israelis, more than 60%, the number is around 66%, want this to be resolved and want the deal and want the hostages back home. The other part of the Israeli society are not saying they don't want the hostages home, but they are worried about what this deal means for the future security of Israel.
Meanwhile, and partly as an illustration of how this conflict is viewed differently inside and outside in terms of what is making news, the first thing that has made news, lead news in a lot of places, is the crossing of that threshold with the Gaza Health Ministry, the Hamas-controlled Gaza Health Ministry, saying 40,000 people have now been killed in Gaza since October the 7th. Of course, as we've said very often, these numbers are disputed. A lot of people think numbers that come from a ministry controlled by Hamas are not reliable. Others say, the United States, for example, that those health ministry figures have tended to bear out. But that hitting that threshold, that number of 40,000 will, of course, make headlines and be seen as significant. But there's a second story which also made headlines around the world, and it turns on the death of two newborn babies reportedly killed in an Israeli airstrike in Gaza, and photographs and footage that went around the world of the father of these two children apparently returning from having just registered them and holding their birth certificates in his hand to hear the news that these two children had been killed along with their mother and grandmother. Obviously a hugely heartbreaking story in itself, but also an example of that is the thing. Well, all the other talk in Israel has been going on about the negotiations and the wait and the hostage deal on or off. It's stories like that that cut through internationally and make a lot of news.
Look, any normal human being who would see this story, their heart would sink. And as you say, the tragedy of this, the continuation of this tragedy and the stretching out of it on both sides, in Gaza and what is happening in Israel to the families of the hostages, the families of the dead, and the families of the evacuees, both from the south and from the north. I think it's also a reminder of how fast news travels without, people checking it. I don't know and the IDF is trying to figure out what happened in that story. The father was quoted at BBC saying, "I don't know what happened. I was told that an Israeli shell fell on our house." A few days before that, there was claims that Israel killed 100 people in a school. It took 20 minutes for the Hamas ministry to say it was 100 people without any of the rubble being cleared. After a few days, this is in the northern part of the Strip, the western part of Gaza City. And after a few days, it was pretty clear, A, that there weren't 100 dead, and B, that most of them were Hamas and Jihad and Palestinian Islamic Jihad operatives. So I think it is a reminder of two things. One, definitely the tragedy of war. And there's no question that there's been a loss of innocent lives and tragedies, but also of how fast everyone is to point a finger and say, Israel killed, as if what happened is that Israeli soldiers marched into a house and shot two 4-day-old babies. So I think it's a reminder of both of those things.
Yeah, I mean, no, I don't think anyone claimed that they'd been shot. I think the claim was that they'd been killed in an airstrike, and that's the claim there. And as for the school building that was hit, that's certainly right that Israel says that the people, the majority, as you say, that were killed were Hamas operatives. That obviously disputed by others who say, yes, some of them were, but a whole lot of other people killed too. This argument will go on and is going on. We should talk about Tisha B'Av, one of the holiest days and indeed a day of mourning in the Jewish calendar. And the stunt that Itamar Ben-Gvir mounted by going onto the Temple Mount on that day, just a huge provocation to do that, because the Temple Mount is simultaneously hugely the most sacred site in Judaism, believed to be that site of not just the site of the temple, but particularly where the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum of the temple, was located. And by the way, for very religious Jewish reasons, there it is thought that Jews should not go there to pray, because the inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, was only to be entered by the high priest on very specific holy days. But also it is the third holiest site in Islam, thought to be the place where Muhammad ascended to the heavens. And so incredibly incendiary location, and there has been a whole set of arrangements known as the status quo, whereby Jews and Muslims sort of have access to their own holy places without really getting in each other's way. And he, Ben-Gvir, the far-right minister for national or public security, went up there on this day. Just a couple of things to say about it. I mean, the one that I think it was fascinating that he was condemned by not only the usual suspects from the left, but also from the right, from the ultra-Orthodox right, who accused him in one of their newspapers of endangering Jewish lives by visiting the Temple Mount, and said Jews going up to the Temple Mount is like throwing a match into an oil well. And I think we might come on to talk about the split between the ultra-religious, sort of ultra-Orthodox and the national religious camps. That's an interesting split, to my mind. But also, just I think it goes back to something we talked about the other day, where I said my view was that Ben-Gvir represents a kind of challenge, if not affront, to religious Judaism. And in a way, this is the sort of thing I had in mind, which is he manages to turn everything sacred, in this case Tisha B'Av, into the ugliest kind of politics. And, this is just a nationalist, I would say kind of supremacist provocation rather than a day of mourning and contemplation. And this is what he does. He just diminishes those things which are valuable in Judaism. And just it seems to me that the more you think about it, the more important it was, how significant it was that day that Netanyahu made the decision to usher in Kahanism, the followers of the teachings of the fascistic rabbi, late Meir Kahane, into the institutions of the Israeli state and indeed the government.
Yeah, and I'm going to add one more thing. You noted that it was Tisha B'Av. It's another important thing to say is that we are at a moment when Israel needs its coalition partners. Now, Jordan, obviously the custodian of the Temple Mount, Saudi Arabia also very important to this. No one wants the status quo, and everyone's watching this very closely. And if you have a minister who's, by the way, responsible for national security, right, that is his portfolio, doing this on the day where Israel the day, the week, the month where Israel needs its coalition partners to help prevent an Iranian attack. It's more than just a provocation or a political stance that is meant to say, I am the most powerful person in this government. So I think we should add that. And you mentioned something that's really important, the condemnation coming from the ultra-Orthodox. And of course, there's an issue of religion here, which you explained rather astutely, right? That they are against these kinds of prayers on the Temple Mount. And since 1967, Jews are not allowed, that is the status quo, to pray on Temple Mount. But the fact that they are condemning Ben-Gvir so severely and even threatening to leave the government, the ultra-Orthodox that are upset at all kinds of things, one of them is the rabbi's law that Ben-Gvir decided that he's not going to pass until he gets a ticket to sit on the war cabinet. So they're very upset about that. It wasn't generally a good week for the ultra-Orthodox because I'll just say this in parentheses, the Attorney General ordered daycare funding cut for ultra-Orthodox students who would defy draft orders. So just in general, they found a way to sort of vent and to threaten Ben-Gvir. They have growing arguments with him, and that is going to be a very interesting thing to watch as this government, as this Knesset comes back in late October.
And all of this is just an interesting reminder, perhaps, of why it was for decades that the ultra-Orthodox parties had no problem sitting in government and working alongside secular parties, because in a way there was this, mutual mutual pact in which the Orthodox were allowed just to do their own thing. And, a secular politician wouldn't be giving them a hard time about their very particular religious doctrines about access to the Temple Mount. Somebody like Ben-Gvir is a harder thing for them to cope with because he's a challenge in a way from within, because he is religious too, or claims to be. They would be people who would think he is an abomination of Judaism, the way he uses it. He wants to make a gesture on the Temple Mount. Back in the day, a Shimon Peres or whatever wasn't going to give the Orthodox parties that headache. He would just let them do their own thing. Are there in there the seeds of, a new constellation of parties in which the Orthodox sit with others who are not of the right and certainly not of the nationalist religious right? Maybe. But it's just a glimmer of how this thing has worked in the past and might work again in the future.
And also an asterisk, it's very interesting to see the difference between religious Zionism, its extremities represented by Ben-Gvir, and the ultra-Orthodox when it comes to the hostage deal. You have clearly the ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas and United Torah Judaism, saying, bring them back, bring the hostages back, have a deal. And you have religious Zionism represented, or the extreme faction of it represented by Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, saying no. So that is also an interesting thing to note. But we need to move on to the next section of our conversation, which is actually to answer listeners' questions. So we have been waiting to do this for a while. And every time we do it, I think we realize two things. Our listeners are very, very smart, which is always really nice. And also that they come from very different places, which is also nice to discover. We are pretty geographically diverse.
No, very much so. I mean, questions from all over the world, from Israelis, from Jewish people, from people who are not Jewish, but in Europe, in the United States, in the Middle East and beyond. I mean, really a huge number of very, very good questions. It was a very tough job to just handpick just a few, because we know we're not going to get time to get to all of them. If you did send in a question and yours is not one of those featured, please don't give up on us. We'll do this again in the future, and hopefully one of yours. In fact,
we're doing it again next week,
yeah,
Jonathan. I don't know if you got the memo.
Yeah, no, we're doing it again next week as well.
Yeah, we got so many, so we had to separate them into two different piles, and we're doing a few questions next week as well.
We are. So, but if you didn't make this and these first couple of rounds, we will come back to this in future episodes in the months ahead. So why don't we kick off, Yonit, let's hear our first question.
This is Marlon Tesla from Frankfurt, Germany. Love the show, listen every week. Following on from this week's brilliant guest interview, talking about the possibility of a civil war in Israel, I was wondering how you would reflect on that, not in light of the ultra-right, but perhaps the demographic changes taking place with the religious, with their much higher birth rate, so that probably in 2 to 3 generations they will have a majority in Israel and will be able to impose laws which might not be to the liking of the working, tax-paying, and military-serving non-religious, and how that could potentially lead to a much wider rift in the country.
Well, this, in a way, I mean, it does go to what we were talking about, in part, about the changes that are going on, particularly in the religious world. I mean, in some ways, Marlon's question sort of just refers to the religious population. And I think what we said was that, there are very many different types of religious Jew. And there is this fascinating split going on between the nationalist religious and the ultra-Orthodox religious camp. But yeah, I think overall there is a lot to think about here. One of the big concerns, and I think we'll talk about this as we get closer to the anniversary, but one of the concerns I've had since October 7th in particular is it's been very noticeable, those people who are so sort of, unsettled and distressed and worn down by the last year, that there are people thinking about leaving the country, that it's just too hard to stay. And a lot of those people come from, that group in the Israeli society that have options internationally, meaning people who are very highly educated, people who speak more than one language and have, high-tech skills and so on. It's just one of the things that it was talked about even when we were, in 2023 around the judicial coup. There is a sort of, when people divide Israel into different tribes, there is one of them that tends to pay the lion's share of the country's taxes, that is responsible for the lion's share of the country's GDP and for its sort of commercial and intellectual output. And those are the people who are most able to leave. And, I always do keep an eye on that group of people, of Israelis. It's essential for the future of the country those people stay. You do not want a country of Itamar Ben-Gvir's or the people who follow him that is out of whack and out of balance. So I do keep an eye on that and think that, Israel is an extraordinary society in the sense of all these very, very different sort of tribes bolted together in one very small place. You don't want that balance to be dramatically shifted. And, there are obviously always sort of warning signs that could change.
It's interesting. We were talking during the judicial coup, you and I, about how Israel is actually four tribes. It's a famous speech given by the former president of this country, Reuven Rivlin. He was talking about the four tribes of Israel: the secular tribe, the religious Zionists, the ultra-Orthodox, and the Arab Israelis. And you and I were talking about how all of this is held together. I think I called it a lot of scotch tape and ambition. And suddenly we saw the beginnings of this tearing or unraveling. And that was the concern. And then October 7th hit. And what hit severely, I think, all the groups in society was the questions, the fundamental questions of who are we, right? If we are the nation that trusts its military more than anything, if we are the nation that would go to the ends of the earth to save one Israeli that was in danger, then who are we now? These are very important questions that we will have to answer to ourselves, and it will take time to answer. But I want to actually go back to the original question, which is a question about demography. And a lot of people are talking about this, and we're talking about this before October 7th, right? The D word. The fact that there are parts of society that in 30 years, right, you will have half of the first graders will be either ultra-Orthodox or Arab Israeli. And what does that mean to Israeli society? And what I would say to that, again, I think we'll, one day when things get back to normal, we'll have a serious discussion, a serious interview here on Unholy about demography. Demography isn't fate. And there are all kinds of undercurrents that we are not seeing, right? Things like, for example, there are from the religious Zionism part of society. There are lots of young women who want to enlist in the military. They don't have to. There are other kinds of programs for them, but they want to go into the military, and they wanted to go into combat military units. That is interesting. There are a lot of ultra-Orthodox behind the scenes, away from the media's eye, that are working on integrating the ultra-Orthodox into society and into the military, in fact. So there's a lot going on that we don't always realize. And, I'm probably an incurable optimist, but I think that it is something that of course should be dealt with and talked about, but not something that everyone should just throw their hands up in despair and say, okay, it's done. This is not, once I wrote you this joke, if Zionism was easy, everyone would be doing it. But the point is that it's hard and it's getting harder, but that doesn't mean there aren't opportunities here to be seized and to be dealt with.
Yep. No, I think that's a very good outlook, and I would agree with you that integration is the name of the game. It was exactly those 4 tribes of Reuven Rivlin that I had in mind when I was talking about those tribes. And I think, I would add that there's work to be done integrating those ultra-Orthodox religious Jews.
I just remember the conversation we had with Nasser Hussein, Nas Daily, right, who's this huge content innovator who grew up in Arab. He's an Arab Israeli who grew up in Arab in the northern part of Israel. And he said to us in that conversation, I have been living here my whole life. No one has ever invited us to Shabbat dinner, my family, right? That is another part of integration that we need to put our efforts in. And this indeed is also getting harder, but that we should focus on as well as Israelis.
Yeah, no, that was exactly where I was going to go, is to say huge effort to be done. There's a job to be done in terms of the ultra-Orthodox, but a huge job to be done with Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel. Nas Daily was a good example of how it could work. There are examples all the time. If, there was a row just this week about an Arab Christian officer in the border police who was due for a promotion to have a big job actually policing around at the Hebron area. Again, Ben-Gvir appears to have blocked it. He wanted an Orthodox Jew, ultra-Orthodox as it happens, to take that person's place. That's just at the political level. I've often thought, since we're talking about on politics, there is a huge electoral prize for whichever party manages to genuinely integrate and appeal to that 20% of the Israeli electorate that is Arab or Palestinian Israeli. That is just sitting there as a block of votes, waiting, it seems to me, to be tapped. And it won't be forever that it is separate to the other parties, the so-called Zionist parties. I think there's huge amounts there to be done. But I keep my eye on it, because somehow those 4 tribes of Reuven Rivlin, yes, they need to integrate, but they also need to be held in balance. And you do not want one of those suddenly becoming overarching and dominant over all the others. And I'm particularly thinking about the potential shrinking of the secular tribe and the dominance that is sought by some members of that nationalist religious camp. Should we go to our next question?
Hi, this is Tal from Tel Aviv, longtime listener, first-time caller. One theme you return to often on the podcast is the outsized influence that Itamar Ben-Gvir, National Security Minister, has on Israeli politics. But one critique that I hear a lot is how Ben-Gvir was normalized by the Israeli media, particularly television news, because he always made for such a compelling, though often controversial interview. There was even a period during the previous government when his airtime as an MK from the opposition was second only to that of Prime Minister Bennett. That's a huge shift from how the media handled someone like Meir Kahane. I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether the media contributed to Ben-Gvir's rise without even realizing it.
It's an very interesting question from Tal. I mean, my one memory on this that may be of some use is just how things were. It's a very long time ago. But when Itamar Ben-Gvir's inspiration, Meir Kahane, was elected into the Knesset, I think in 1984, it was fascinating how the political class, it wasn't just the media, decided that he should just be blacklisted, shunned. No one would speak to him in the Knesset. People would walk out when he spoke, and he was certainly, banned from the airwaves as well. There was just a decision taken that this person was beyond the pale, and that was 4 decades ago, and obviously norms have changed, and it's not just the media. I mean, the politics has changed as well. That this person is suddenly, and people like him are part of the conversation in a way they weren't 4 decades ago. I would say as well, I just look at for example, social media. There were people who are voicing views on social media, on X or on Twitter, that, when I was growing up, you would have had to seek out far-right racist material. I'm talking now about Britain, which you would have had to go to almost, shops in dark alleyways and sort of know who to speak to be handed material of far-right racist material. It is now on your phone. It's a click away. So I'm just thinking this is part of a broader trend. But, you take it where you want to take it, Yoni.
I mean, there are things to look at on a few levels in this question. It's an important question, a very legitimate one. I'll start and I'll end in the same place. The person who gave Itamar Ben-Gvir the legitimacy is Benjamin Netanyahu, who put him as a minister in the government, and not only a minister, but a minister in charge of the police. But that is not enough of an answer. And I think we need to look at what kind of person he is and what he has been doing for the past couple of decades in Israel. First of all, remember, this is a man who attacked Yitzhak Rabin's car. He was part of the incitement before Yitzhak Rabin was murdered. That is how he was known to most Israelis. We'll also say he was indicted 53 times and convicted 8 times. But he has begun this journey into the heart of the Israeli mainstream in 2 ways. One, trying to make himself much more palatable, right? I mean, I'm not calling for the death of all Arabs. Of course, I'm calling for the death of terrorists. I had this picture of Baruch Goldstein, who murdered 29 Muslim worshippers. I'm taking it down from my wall. That is his journey. But also, remember what he tried to do. He became a lawyer, also highly contested debate inside the Israeli Bar Association if to agree to make this man a lawyer. But the minute he became a lawyer, he began to represent the far right, people who were indicted of terrorist activities. Thus, he became a guest on a lot of shows on television, news programs that wanted to hear from the attorney of these people. The people themselves weren't speaking. And little by little, he became this, the more and more sort of palatable figure. And to add to that, and you kind of mentioned that in what you said, but social media plays a role. It's very nice that we can have these conversations, and we had a lot of them about Itamar Ben-Gvir over the years in the newsroom. But the point is that at the end of the day, things that were completely illegitimate, right? Alex Jones 30 years ago would be a crazy person holding a sign at the entrance to the IRS. And today he has a huge following because of social media. So even if the regular, what is it called today, legacy media, mainstream media would say, we're not interviewing this man, the rest, he doesn't need us anymore in the sense that he's on TikTok, he's on Instagram. That is not even our concern. So there's a lot of things that are going on here. But at the end of the day, again, there was one man who, by the way, I think it was the last interview to mainstream media. I interviewed him in February of 2021. He said, Ben-Gvir will not be a minister in my government. He will not agree to our red lines, and he won't be a minister. I mean, that's important. It's not important only because it's a promise that Netanyahu made and he didn't keep. There are other, of those around. But it's important because that is what the sentiment was. And the man who changed it is Netanyahu himself. Finally, I'll just say, Jeff Zucker, who was president of CNN, and was talking about the fact that he would allow for all of these rallies to run on CNN, the Trump rallies before the 2016 elections. He ran those in full. And he said later that he thought that it might have contributed to how, mainstream Trump had become. I think the one lesson that I can say was to think that if you allow for these views to be the populist views, to be on air unfiltered, it would expose what the person himself thinks, and thus the public will be outraged. I think that is a mistake. To think that that is the only thing that only if you only see the true face of the person, then the public will ostracize him. That, I think, is a mistake.
Yeah, I think your point about
that
social
was a
media.
long, convoluted answer to Tal.
No, I think it's an important answer. So let's go to our next question, which comes from James, who is in Seattle, Washington.
Growing up in England, especially through the Intifada of the early 2000s, I've always felt a huge kinship and warmth towards Israel and its people. It's why the attitudes and protests on US campuses are so maddening. It feels like the Jewish community has always been an intensely private one. So what can we as Christians who want to support our Israeli Jewish brothers and sisters do to make them not feel so alone?
First of all, thank you for the question. I mean, the actual asking of the question, James, is heartwarming. And the realization that we're all having a very tough time, whether it be Israelis or Jews around the world. I would actually recommend listening to our conversation with Van Jones a few weeks ago, a CNN commentator, who is a friend of the Jewish community and understands Israel and is not a sort of blind supporter of everything that Israel does, but does understand deeply the sort of conflicts and the hardships that Israelis are dealing with these days. And I think that would give, I hope you agree, Jonathan, sort of a roadmap on how to be supportive of this community that feels that it is many times not looked at as a minority that is persecuted when it actually is. And I think that is maybe the heart of the matter.
So this is very interesting, I think, on how Christians can better support the Israeli Jewish community. So look, obviously there's, it will be very appreciated, the offer of solidarity and sympathy from people who are not Jewish, to students, for example, who have had a pretty tough year. on American campuses, but all around the world, actually, where, those encampments and so on have not made life easy for many Jewish students. But since you James, has very specifically mentioned Christians, I just couldn't pass up the opportunity to say this, which is, at the moment, Christian support for Israel tends to be voiced in the terms of the evangelical right, particularly in America, who have support for a very particular version of Israel, which is in some ways the version of Israel we've been talking about, which is a kind of hawkish and often, biblically envisioned notion of Israel. Whereas in the way that I've been articulating on this podcast for a long time, I'm not sure that's so great for Israel. We heard it just earlier when we were talking about Itamar Ben-Gvir and his visit to Temple Mount. I think some on the right in evangelical Christianity are very sort of fired up by that notion of a Jewish return and temple and so on. For the actual people on the ground, that could spell conflagration and disaster. So I think if Christians really want to be supportive of Israel, yes, that human empathy for Jews who have had a pretty tough time of it. But I also do think carefully about which vision of Israel you're supporting. And is it just the vision of one of those, and even a corner of one of those four tribes of Israel we were describing, meaning the ultra-nationalist religious vision, rather than what's best for Israel as a whole? And I think that would be the kind of support that perhaps would be even more helpful.
So let's hear our final question for this episode.
Shalom, it's Noga. Do you think that there is a true reason for optimism and hope that the hostages will come back home soon to their loved ones? Or is it just a bit naive to think that way? I guess I just don't want to ask the same thing on day 400 of this war.
Noga has been a longtime listener to our podcast. We're really thankful for that. And by the way, some of her friends have let us know that it's her birthday. So Noga, happy birthday, first of all, and thanks for listening to us. We really appreciate it. There's nothing naive about thinking that the hostages would be released after more than 300 days. I think if something happened to us on October 7th was that our common sense got knocked out. But the common sense is that they should be on their way home. And we really hope that is what is going to happen. It's hard to imagine that it's been so long and the Israelis that were abducted from their homes, and are pretty close to Israel. That's the frustrating thing about it. Israel has not been able to bring them back home. And I hope that will change very soon.
Yeah, and we are grateful to you in particular, Noga, because more than once you have given us a little ray of optimism just by the fact of your engagement and your involvement and your enthusiasm for this podcast and your clear care and concern for those hostages, for Israel and for the Jewish people. So a little bit of inspiration that has come back from you, once again heard by our listeners on Unholy. We're going to have more listeners' questions next week, we hope, and we will honour our tradition by handing out some awards. We thought we would begin with a Chutzpah award, Yonit.
We did something interesting this week. We threw it out to our listeners on Instagram, what they would want. So I would tell you that a lot of them gave the Chutzpah award to Ben-Gvir this week because of the Temple Mount. And we talked about this earlier in our program. But another idea that, by the way, also came from our Instagram page, and I wholeheartedly agree with this, is for a Chutzpah award to Rachel Zegler. She's the actress playing Snow White in the new version that has Gal Gadot as the evil queen. Now, the trailer for Snow White got hit instantly by online backlash against Gal Gadot. Really, anti-Semites, people who hate Israel, everything, you name it, were against this great actress and wonderful person, Gal. And what we're giving Rachel Zegler the Chutzpah Award for was that online she seemed to be encouraging these people. She tweeted, "I love you all so much. Thank you for the love." And then her next tweet was, "Always remember Free Palestine." There were also people online looking at her body language while standing next to Gal Gadot in all of these premieres. Let us remind our listeners, Gal Gadot is a huge superstar and looking like she's highly uncomfortable standing to next to this Israeli star, that whatever you think about the war in Gaza has nothing Gal Gadot has absolutely nothing to do with it. So that's just a thing to maybe point out.
Yeah, I think it's really important you gave it the context there. We're not saying that just tweeting Free Palestine immediately qualifies you for the Chutzpah Award. It was the context in which her co-star and colleague was being bombarded by a whole lot of hate for being Israeli. And at that moment, to signal that somehow, it looked like a signal of encouragement, exactly as you say. We thought we would do a mention en route to our Mensch Award, and that is a fabulous story from Angela Merkel, the former Chancellor of Germany, saying that she had wanted to live in Kibbutz Sde Boker, which our audience will know was the home of Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion. Angela Merkel had aspirations to follow his lead and spend time on that kibbutz. She said it was an idea that she had toyed with for after retiring from politics. So this wasn't some sort of gap year student urge. During her time as Chancellor, she toyed with the idea of moving to Israel and specifically to that kibbutz. Like many others, I have made the little pilgrimage and visited the site, the hut that Ben-Gurion made his home, and how it was lined with books upon books upon books. He would sit in there reading the works of Aristotle. That was the way he would mark Yom Kippur. I can see fellow cerebral politician Angela Merkel having been very comfortable in Kibbutz Sde Boker. It says something about the bond between contemporary Germany and Israel. But alas, it never happened. But a mention for her en route to our Mensch Award, Yoni.
Indeed. And we'll thank Safuni, who's a journalist in Berlin. He writes for Globes, who pointed that out on his Twitter feed. So Mensch Award, I mean, this story is really, if you need to smile this week, it's such a lovely story. It starts with the fact that Oded Ben-Ami, who's a colleague and a friend, and he anchors the 6 o'clock program on our network, Channel 12, last week, sort of had this. He spoke personally to President Biden. He said, he opened the show. He said, I want to thank the president for everything that he has been doing for Israel. It was sort of a response to things that sources close to the prime minister were saying against Biden at the time. This was translated to English and in all kinds of ways, brought to the attention of the president himself, who went on, President Biden, to call Oded Ben-Ami a few nights later at midnight and to speak with him for 12 minutes and thank him for this gesture of his. So I think the president deserves a Mensch Award for doing that. It's pretty remarkable, right? Calling an Israeli journalist to thank him for something he said on air. It was, Oded obviously was quite moved by it. And so were we all at our network.
No, it is wonderful. And it reflects so well on Joe Biden. It reminds me slightly of that music reviewer who once wrote a whole review about Frank Sinatra and then got a phone call from Frank Sinatra. It's that sort of thing that you don't actually think it could ever happen. I note, remember many, I think, of the hostage families have said they have had more contact from Joe Biden than they have had from Israel's prime minister. Biden is so involved and engaged. And to use that word, because we may not get many more opportunities to say this, given that his exit from the arena that is coming in the next few months. Joe Biden gets Israel and feels for it in his kishkas, and this is yet more evidence of it. So a worthy winner of Mensch of the Week for US President Joe Biden. And if you want to phone either of us to talk about it, President Biden, we're both here. We are ready.
I got a happy birthday, man.
You got a happy birthday.
Good. I'm done.
You're done. I think if you want to call anyone, you know my number. So that would be good. We are almost out of time. We will be back with listeners' questions this time next week. And time to say our thank yous.
We will. Our big thank yous to Omer Primat and to Michal Porat. Please check out our show notes because we have all kinds of social media links and a new email for you. And we shall meet next week.
See you then.